Okay, so it's 11 o'clock on Friday morning, and it's a great day. As you can see behind me, I'm in the heart of Niagara wine country, actually on the bench. And it's another hot, hot day in Niagara, uh, celebrating I4C in a traditional way in this cool climate that we have. It's over 30 degrees outside with lots of humidity, and really excited to be here today to welcome this esteemed panel, which I'll get to in just a moment. We're missing one person who we know will be joining us momentarily. But we're here today to kick off the i4C 2020 virtual edition, and we're super excited that we can actually have this weekend this year, considering that we can't all be together in person. And there I see Ian Dagada. It will be joining us in just a moment. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to the board members of the i4C for working together to put this weekend together. It's really exciting. We have people from all across the globe that are joining us right now, hundreds of people. So thank you all for tuning in and making the beginning of this weekend so special. Today, and just to point out, if you want to see what's happening all weekend, please go to our coolchardonnay.org web page, and also the social channels with all kinds of updates on what's happening. Today, actually, we have two webinars, and I'm just making this introduction for the first webinar. So thank you again to all the board members, and I also wanted to make a special note and thank you to the sponsors of this weekend. So myself, Magdalena Kaiser, I work with VQA Wines of Ontario and Wine Country Ontario, and we're happy to be a founding sponsor and a partner through this weekend to help you bring together this great program. Also, thank you to the Grape Growers of Ontario for being a continuing important sponsor. Also the LCBO, Arterra, and also Wine and Spirits Magazine for their support, and also Black River Cheese for their support. So now I just want to talk briefly just about housekeeping. Anyone that's on this call probably has been on a number of Zoom calls in the last few months, and so you're probably all experts, and you don't need to really be told this, but if you we're going to be running through the 1-hour webinar session with our great panelists. But then at the end, there's a question and answer, which I see there's already a little question up there. I'll check in a moment. So please, if you have any questions along the way, please do put them in the Q&A area, and we will monitor those and ask the panel questions at the end, and we'll get through as many as possible. In the meantime, if you want to use the chat area, please feel free to, say hello to your neighbor that you can see that's also on the chat. It's just an exciting way to kind of keep momentum up and let everyone know who's all in the room together. So again, we're here together celebrating a decade of cool. It was 10 years ago that this celebration was founded, and the panel that we have together, I'm hoping everyone's taking pictures of their screens actually maybe when I'm gone, because we have 4 amazing people from all across the globe, some of the most important wine writers of our generations, and to have them together in this one Zoom webinar is super exciting. I can't wait to hear the discussions. So first and foremost, welcome to Andrew Jefford, who was hoping to be here live this year as our keynote. He is in southern France, so really excited to have you here today. And I'm going to briefly introduce each of you, because if I actually went through your bios and all of those details, the hour of the session would probably be over and we wouldn't get to speak with you. So Andrew's going to begin things with a keynote address, and then he's going to interview each of Matt Kramer, Karen MacNeil, and Ian Dagada, and they are all past keynotes of the i4C. So again, really excited to have all of you. Matt is in San Francisco. He was our first keynote 10 years ago for i4C. I can't believe that's how long it's been. And been to Ontario a couple times. Ian D'Agata, of course, lives in Rome, is Canadian, and frequents Ontario, and always a great supporter. And he is in somewhere on a road between Champagne and Beaujolais. We're not really quite sure. So great to have him. And then Karen MacNeil is in Napa, California, apparently really, really hot there. And she had a quick visit with us a couple years ago and hopefully can come back soon again. So I think I've hopefully covered everything. And so I will hide myself from the screen and hand things over to Andrew. So welcome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great to be with you. Good morning, everybody. Great to be with you from my not so cool climate down in the south of France. Well, as Magdalena just said, we're going to be reviewing the last decade of wine evolution in cool climate Chardonnay around the world with the three former keynote speech givers in 15 minutes, Matt Kramer, Ian D'Agata, and Karen MacNeil. And there'll be time for your questions at the very end. But to begin with, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the beyond of cool climate and after, if you like. By the way, before I begin, just to give us a technical fix, we'll take cool to mean 7-month median growing season temperature below 16 centigrade, that's 61 Fahrenheit, growing degree days below 1500, intermediate would be 16 to 18.5, median temperature, that's 61 to 65 Fahrenheit, growing degree days 1500 to 1700, and warm would be above that, and of course hot above that. End of technical interlude. I won't get technical after that point, I promise. So the point I'd really like to make is that cool climate itself on its own isn't enough. It's what you then go on and do within that climate that counts. What you really want in the long run is for your place to be perceived as a great terroir and for your wines to be sought after both as capsules of deliciousness and compelling expressions of place. A climate, remember, is just a single strand of that very complex equation. It's a partial proposal for terroir, if you like. It's step one of the stairway. If we could have our first image up now, please. But a terroir itself is a distinguished site, to use Brian Crozer's durable phrase, durable terminology. It's a single site or it's a collection of sites. The concept, of course, can exist at different scales. You have Burgundy, you have the Côte de Beaune, you have Nassau, you have Charme, all different scales, but they all have a terroir identity. And of course, there are other strands of the concept. You have soil, topography, latitude, altitude, and of course the human catalyst. But it's distinction itself that we must be looking for. That really is the quest. Remember, we don't drink climates, we don't drink places, we don't drink seasons in isolation, we don't drink soils, we drink wine, and the lovelier, the better. The proof of a distinguished site is the enduring loveliness of the wines it produces, vintage after vintage. And we keep returning to beautiful and inspiring wines. We want to own them, to possess them, to age and mature them, to maximize our exposure to them. We're greedy for them. Our sensual passion for them makes us throw money at them without heed of the morrow. And that really is what every vineyard owner wants when all's said and done. They want drinkers to be greedy for their wines because of their innate sensual appeal. And it's that which makes us feel a reverence for the place in which such wines come into being. And it's distinction itself which projects a place into the pantheon of places. And the basis of a distinguished site is not its climate data, but the gorgeousness of the wines that can be produced there. Yes, climate's very important in that. As I said, it's step one in the definition of a terroir. Climate really is what governs the economic viability of a viticultural site. Most soils, remember, will support viticulture. Most climates won't. One definition of a cool climate would be one whose pattern of heat inputs is just adequate to produce balanced wine from that variety or those varieties considered to be early ripening, and to do this regularly enough for viticulture to be economically viable there in the long term. Now, historically, we know these conditions have produced sought-after wines in Europe, but it's also important to remember that they've also produced a colossal amount of thin and shrill and uninteresting wine in Europe as well, in places largely abandoned today. Now we're talking about variety, so we can welcome Chardonnay to the party. If we could go on to the next image, please. Chardonnay is perhaps the most emblematic of all cool climate or early ripening varieties. And Chardonnay wines, when grown in the right sites, can shoot loveliness out all over us. So in that sense, it might almost be regarded as a kind of litmus for cool climate. It's not the only one. There's Riesling as well. Pinot Noir is a third. And I think those three together really should be regarded as the great cool climate triumvirate. Now, I emphasize deliciousness, since it seems to me that researchers and opinion formers, and sometimes even winemakers, can get a little bit carried away with the reactive side of things. They come to regard cool climate as a kind of austere holy grail. Grail in hand, the perceived difficulties of boisterous ripeness and of lavish alcohol levels will in theory drop away. But remember that cool climate shouldn't mean punishing, painful, taut, tight, and costive. It shouldn't mean dry, short, sharp, and bitter. It shouldn't mean lean and mean. Those things may be cool as hell among opinion formers and hipster drinkers, but no one who wants to drink live wine for a lifetime of pleasure is ever going to want to fill up their cellar with wines like that. They're going to run a mile from wines like that. Cool climate should mean a particular sort of deliciousness, a particular sort of music. The charm may be slender and fugitive rather than ample in contour, but charm there must be. Sensual allure and sensual intoxication must always be there. And if you're lean and mean, yes, the geeks will like you for a while. They'll declare you hip and sacred, but the geeks will move on sooner or later. Once some other irresistible heresy swings into view, and your market will drift away once the geeks have moved on. Only deliciousness will save you. If you're going to be cool forever, you have to be deliciously cool. Let's take some European examples. There is, as it were, kind of base camp. That's where all this stuff originally comes from. I'll give you a Chardonnay example, and then I will look at the two others involving different varieties. So let's start with Chablis, almost certainly what most people think about first when they start talking about cool climate Chardonnay. In John Gladstone's seminal 1992 book, Viticulture and Environment, Chablis is logged with a degree day total of 1152. Well, it'll certainly be warmer than that now, but even so, it remains a kind of cool climate Chardonnay ideal. No one in Chablis is trying to make cool climate Chardonnay. What are they trying to do? They're trying to make the ripest, most balanced wines they can make under the vintage circumstances. They won't hesitate to chaptalize, to lift wealth and mouth architecture if necessary, and they'll put their wines through malolactic in order to temper their acidity. The character that Chablis lovers latch onto is a mouth-watering deliciousness made by pushing and prodding and wrestling Chardonnay towards full ripeness in a cool and fretful place with a long growing season, with long summer day lengths, with variable expositions, and with several different types of limestone soil. And the Chablis wines which command the highest prices, remember, and evolve over the longest time in the cellar, are not the meanest and leanest. They're the very ripest, the Grand Cru. You're looking at them now. This is a view of the Grand Cru vineyards. We'll go on to a second example. Much the same is true in Germany's Saar Valley, where degree days are generally lower than those in Chablis, though they're even more site-specific. Now, Saar wine growers are also engaged in a wrestle for ripeness. Indeed, I don't think any growers on earth think in a more sophisticated way about ripeness than German wine growers, or dissect ripeness more minutely. And the time-honored solution to the problem of cool climate imbalance in the Saar, in other words, of huge acidity combined with what were often relatively modest natural sugar levels, is to stop fermentation early. You then leave fruit-saturated, unfermented sugars capable of balancing out those acidity levels. In this way, you make something beautiful out of something imbalanced. The quest was for deliciousness above all. And once deliciousness had been identified and found, then what must always have been a difficult and testing and hazardous and patchy cool climate region suddenly became, or wouldn't have suddenly become, gradually became a great terroir. The third example is Alsace, and we can look at that picture now. This, by the way, is Schlossberg, looking down to the village of Kaisersberg. Now, in John Gladstone's book, Colmar, which is what he takes to be typical of Alsace, falls in degree day terms somewhere between what you'd find in Côte d'Or and what you'd find in Mâconnais. In other words, it lies somewhere out towards the warmer end of cool climate. And really, it's still in that position, even though it's certainly pushing at the door of intermediate nowadays. Alsace, of course, is unusual amongst European cool climate regions in that its wines are articulated through a range of different grape varieties. And in this plurivarietal sense, it's really got much more in common with many non-European wine regions. The extensive use of varietal labeling in Alsace is another point it has in common with non-European cool climate regions. And also, like many non-European cool climate regions, Alsace has been on a quest to discover terroir in its wines, or rather rediscover it, since this was lost in the past, in particular when the region changed nationality no fewer than 5 times between 1870 and 1945. Now here again, growers aren't detained by their cool climate status in thinking that they ought to make wines which conform in any way whatsoever to cool climate stereotypes. Quite the contrary. They plunder the climate for all the wealth it can offer. And in the case of Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer, that's considerable, lavish, exotic, opulent wines very often. Even the driest of Grand Cru Schlossberg Rieslings is a structured wine. And the exquisite differences that you can see between the granite of Schlossberg and the limestone of somewhere like Rosaca will really only reach full expression in ripe fruit. Turckheim, by the way, more or less in the middle of the wine-growing region, lies about a half a degree north of Chablis. So you've got 2 cool climates on equivalent latitude in the same wine-growing nation, but very different places by dint of their topography and their soils and their varieties and their cultures. Both make delicious wine, but those wines are utterly different from one another. The differences are clear, and there's a very useful lesson in those differences. Those differences emerge because for centuries producers have been blissfully unaware of the fact that they are cool climate producers and serenely unconcerned by their status. They're just wine growers in a particular place who want to make delicious wine. Wines to inspire greediness and covetousness, wines which conform as closely as possible to the unique form of expression which the place seems to ask them to make. Now, of course, I know all this is much easier if you've got hundreds of years of tradition to fall back on. But tradition, as Émile Pénaud once observed, is an experiment which has succeeded. You have to try things. Economic success will tell you what works. But economic success for wine is not measured by how well a particular Chardonnay conforms to an ideal predicated on climate. Success for wine is measured by a kind of regional allure that can be duplicated nowhere else. Success for wine is measured by the world slowly coming to acclaim a region's distinguished sites and collections of sites. And above all, economic success for wine is measured by empty glasses, empty decanters, and repeat purchases, by deliciousness, in a word. And for me, this really is what Cool Climate Chardonnay producers, and indeed Cool Climate anything producers, should be focusing on. Okay, that's more or less what I wanted to say. So now what I thought we would do is go through each of our former keynotes in turn and explore a particular topic. So that means in about 30 minutes, we'll be looking at Chardonnay itself with Karen. In about 15 minutes, we'll tackle the unavoidable topic of climate change with Ian. But we're going to begin with Matt, keynote speech giver in both 2011 and 2015. And what we're going to do is tackle the general topic of the aesthetics of cool, which follows fairly naturally on from what I've just said, though of course Matt may completely disagree with what I've just said. By the way, Karen and Ian will intervene as they see fit at any point. They're very welcome to do that. And we'll of course be tackling a selection of your questions at the end. So Matt, great to have you with us. Now let's...
Lovely to be here.
It's good to be here together. It's fantastic. Do you think there's been a sort of evolution in the expression of cool climate wines over the last decade? You've got that wonderful multi-decade view now. What do we used to want with cool climate wine? What do we want nowadays?
Well, if we look back 40 years, I've been writing for 42 years now. First of all, 42 years ago, there wasn't any discussion of cool climate. It's actually a very modern phrase. You had Burgundy, and you didn't have Burgundy, you had Bordeaux, whatever the case may be. And the climate was whatever it was. The notion of cool climate, at least in my opinion, is in many ways a new world concept. And it's a new world concept, and this refers back to something you were saying previously, Andrew. It's a new world concept because the new world, unlike the old world, proceeds from a basis of choice. If in the old world you were stuck at Côte-Rôtie or Hermitage or, you know, godforsaken hillsides in Germany that seemingly nothing could grow on, you did the best you could. You planted whatever you thought might grow. And as you point out, you tried to create deliciousness if you possibly could. But the truth of the matter is that it was, to use a certain kind of word, it was quote unquote primitive. You were anchored to your place and the primitiveness of it because you couldn't move. You either couldn't move economically because you couldn't afford it. You couldn't move politically because you weren't allowed. So you made your spot work and you found grapes, if grapes is indeed what you were growing. You tried to make that work. The New World, however, was always about movement and choice. If you didn't like this spot in California because it was too hot or it was too cool, you moved somewhere else. And the same, of course, in Okanagan or in Ontario or in New Zealand or Australia. And so cool climate then became a function of choice. So, for example, the University of California at Davis famously came up with its regions 1 through 5, based on temperature summation of 500-degree days. Region 1 being the coolest, region 5 being the warmest. But one of the things that we have to remember is that the academic researchers, they weren't wrong by any stretch, but they had a responsibility. And their responsibility was to make sure that whatever you grew would ripen, would reach, as you call it, some level of deliciousness, because it would have been irresponsible for them to say, yes, you know, you can go to this place, the extreme Sonoma Coast here in California, but might not ripen regularly, might not ripen to what you're calling deliciousness. If you were a university professor, it would be irresponsible for you to legitimatize, validate such a place. Which brings me to one other point. The nature of fine wine in general, and anything any of us might call cool climate, ultimately relates to it's not a sure thing. Everywhere in the world where people either have a cool climate and were stuck with it, as in Europe, or chose it in the New World, ultimately we have embraced a premise that it's not a sure thing. it's not a sure thing that it will ripen every year, whether it's Pinot Noir in Oregon or in the coolest sections of California or in some very unusual places in New Zealand, and of course, not least, Ontario. And cool climate at root is an acceptance of and a validation of and a legitimatization of it's not a sure thing. If it is, then it's probably not cool climate.
Okay. I mean, do you think elements like acidity and alcohol are preoccupying a lot of cool climate producers excessively nowadays? Is that something that you feel is happening or not? I mean, you mentioned this,
well,
this just getting there being part of the definition of cool climate, but in many accepted cool climate regions, we get there quite easily nowadays. And people are beginning to stress.
And then that's a legitimate question. Is it then cool climate? Again, it all depends, of course, and obviously everyone knows this, it all depends upon the grape variety. It's the grape that will determine whether or not it's, quote, cool climate or not. Let's start at the simplest level. If one has to add acidity because the level of acidity is too low for the grape variety in question, then I think it's a legitimate statement that it's not cool climate, because cool does have as its basis certainly an ample amount or a sufficient amount of acidity. And if it's collectively perceived that for the grape variety in question, the acidity is too low and you need to add acidity for that particular grape that you're making into wine, then I think we can legitimately say, well, that's not a cool climate. What the specifics of that acidity may be is another question. And of course, as Ian could easily talk about, there are some grape varieties that are intrinsically very high in acidity. And you can't say that, for example, Nebbiolo and Barbera, both in Piemonte. And you can't say that Piemonte is a cool climate area because it's really not. But if you looked at it just through the narrow lens of acidity and through the particular lens of Barbera, which is intrinsically high in acidity, and Nebbiolo, the same thing, you would say, well, it must be cool climate. Look at the levels of acidity on those wines. And yet, of course, acidity alone is not the measure. I come back to what I said earlier. The measure is it's not a sure thing for the grape in question.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people would have difficulty reconciling the idea that Nebbiolo could be an appropriate variety for a cool climate. I think cool climate, for most people, in most people's minds, is identified with varieties like Riesling and Pinot and Chardonnay and so on. And given that, do you think there is an overly homogenistic aesthetic in many cool climate regions? This is something I worry about a little bit. One reason why I said what I wanted to say in the little keynote I've just delivered, because if you look at a region like Alsace, which is genuinely cool climate, I think, by most parameters, there's a huge wealth of expression there. And I often feel that many producers working in cool climate regions are kind of backing themselves into a corner because of this notion of cool climate.
Well, I'm not sure that it's a function of climate that's creating this homogenization that you're referring to. I think part of it has to do with the fact that we are profoundly interconnected, especially in terms of winemaking technique and the celebration of certain winemaking techniques that didn't even exist when I first started out in the mid-1970s. I mean, in the mid-1970s, most wine producers in California had very little understanding, sometimes, I'm sorry to say this, even interest in what people and winemakers in France were doing. Now, the Cabernet producers in Napa were certainly always interested in what the people in Bordeaux did. But I remember Richard Graff, Dick Graff, who founded Chalone and was a graduate of UC Davis winemaking school. He was astonished at the time that there was absolutely no interest in how the Burgundians were making their Pinot Noir and especially their Chardonnay, lees stirring, all that sort of thing. It was really largely unknown. And maybe it was in curiosity, but a lot of it was difficult. You had to go over there. Back then, if you were an American, you had to speak French because the French didn't speak English. And if they did speak English, they wouldn't speak English. And now that's completely changed. And so we're now in a world where producers in New Zealand or Australia or Ontario or Oregon or California know perfectly well what people in Mount Etna in Sicily are doing with Nerello Mascalese. And consequently, there's a certain amount of validation and legitimatization of certain techniques. We're seeing this, for example, with Chardonnay, with reductive techniques in crafting Chardonnay. It's partly a fashion, partly just what you were referring to about deliciousness. I, of course, love reductive things because I love rocks, and anything that reminds me of rock licking is just fine with me, and reductive winemaking emphasizes that. But if you really loved opulent, luscious fruit, that sort of style of Chardonnay just simply wouldn't gratify. And I think, just to add, there is a difference between style and character. And a lot of the deliciousness that you were referring to earlier was a function of character. It transcended generations and it transcended winemaking styles. If today the likes of Jean-François Coche-Dury in Burgundy, very reductive style of winemaking, is the most celebrated at the moment among critics such as all of ourselves. I don't know anybody who doesn't like Coche-Dury's wines. But I think if we went back 100 years ago, his winemaking style would not have been celebrated. I've had, as I'm sure many of you have had, quite old Chardonnays, and they were very different than some of the Chardonnays that are the most highly acclaimed today. So style is one thing, function of fashion, function of the needs of a time, psychologically or otherwise. Character, however, is forever. Grand Cru Chablis is Grand Cru Chablis, not because it's been so designated by Appellation Contrôlée, but because its exposure creates the kind of ripeness, which in turn creates the kind of deliciousness that you were referring to. And that has been going on for centuries. Now, when we get to climate change with Ian, that may end for Grand Cru Chablis, on which I will cry my eyes out. But that may be what happens next. It's not for me to say. So,
just before we leave you, Matt,
okay.
Talk about Chardonnay, of course, and you're a great Burgundy expert. Just tell us briefly if you feel the world now has alternatives, genuine alternatives to Burgundy as fine, cool climate Chardonnay producing regions. Do you have wines of that sort in your cellar, as well as all those delicious Burgundies you have too?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, Burgundy is the mother house. Nobody denies it. I don't know of any Chardonnay, and especially Pinot Noir producer, who does not pray to the Burgundian Mecca on a regular basis. They showed us the way. They gave us a vocabulary. They provided us a cultural aesthetic. It was their vision about site specificity that made so many of us, both as wine lovers and of course wine producers as well, say, yes, that's the way forward. That's the quote unquote answer, or one of the answers that we're looking for. But to assume that it's only confined to Burgundy, well, that's of course long, long, long gone. I mean, California has numerous spots, the Santa Rita Hills, Carneros, the extreme Sonoma coast, certain parts of Mendocino, obviously, the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which has seen a tremendous transformation in the quality of its Chardonnays. I know because I was the wine critic for the Oregonian newspaper for 26 years, when they, swapped out Clone 108, which was the one that was most common in California and was very suited to what was then the traditional Chardonnay climates of California, and then moved on to the so-called Dijon clones. All of a sudden, the quality of the Chardonnays changed enormously. And that's another element, of course, which is, finding just the right material. We're very impatient. We look at the received and settled answers of Burgundy and we think, oh God, but the truth of the matter is I remember being stunned to discover when I wrote a very long piece about Hansel Winery in Sonoma County many years ago. And when it was founded in 1952, there were fewer than 100 acres of Chardonnay in all of California. And that didn't change for at least another 20 years. It's shocking. So it's all very new. California now has, Karen could say better than I, but I think it's got to be closing in on 100,000 acres or more. I don't know. Karen would know more and better than I. But the key point is we're all new to this, and we're all new to the challenge of what we call cool climate, which is a very modern locution. But what we're really new to is the challenge of it's not a sure thing. And how do we slowly, gradually try and make it as sure a thing as we can in a context where ideally it's never quite a sure thing. And by the way, I do have to add, I adore Ontario Chardonnays. I have them in my cellar when I can haul them back. And, you know, Magdalena, I can tell you all about it. My admiration and love of Ontario Chardonnay is greater than anybody else I know. I'm probably bang the drum here in the United States for those wines more than anybody that I've met or heard about it.
Fantastic.
So, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Matt. And you're quite right to stress the longevity of all of this. What will Ontario Chardonnay be like when they've had 1,000 years to practice it, as the Burgundians had 1,000 years to practice their technique? The mind boggles. We just don't know. Now, let's go on to Ian, who's hiding behind his sheets at the moment. So, Ian, we've got to talk about climate change because it's something that's on our minds to such an extent at the moment. We may have 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming in the next 5 years. The Paris goal of 2 degrees centigrade looks pretty unattainable. People are talking about 5 degrees by 2050. All of this is an enormous challenge for us. Cool climate regions have often thought to be well placed as far as this whole climate change phenomenon is concerned, but there's also the problem of wild weather, isn't there, Ian? Tell us what you think about how cool climate regions will fare as climate change gears up.
There is. Although some people still like to diminish the role of climate change and human intervention on it, we have a lot of data that really should make us stop and think. And most of this data comes from a very serious organization, which is the i4C, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which was created in 1988 by the UNEP, by the United Nations Environmental Program, and WMO, the World Meteor Organization. And it basically helps to give us a scientific viewpoint on climate change, and it helps us understand where we're headed. And the first thing to understand is that from the year of 1750 to about 2007, carbon dioxide emissions have increased by about 36%, methane by about 150%. The estimate is, like you were saying, that by 2100, the CO2, the atmospheric CO2 will be increased by 250% at roughly 900.
Okay, at my end, we've lost Ian. I don't know if you've still got Ian, Karen, or have you not?
I think the screen is just frozen. So
150 parts per million. What is does is it has tremendous changes, and the weather in this case. I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
We're having some difficulty, but keep going, keep going. We'll persist for another 3 or 4 minutes.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
We can.
a little better.
Wow, sorry about that. Let me know if something happens. The bottom line is that we talk of higher temperatures, but in fact, as I think you were alluding to, what climate change really involves is not just higher summers, but it involves longer and extended periods of drought, more extreme drought. It involves warmer winters, which is a real huge problem relative to pest control. It involves water shortages, and it involves an increase, and we're seeing this all the time now, of freak weather episodes, be they forest fires, be they floods, be they tsunamis. And so it's an all-encompassing problem that's only going to get worse unless we intervene somehow. There are studies that show the University of Adelaide has come up with studies, a 2013 study, whereby Southern Australia will probably see a reduction of 30% of its fresh water in the next 50 years, and probably a loss of its viticultural habitat by about 40%. Study by Kirkpatrick in 2011 was postulating that in the next 50 years, about half of Napa and Santa Barbara will no longer be able to produce premium wine grapes. An earlier study by Kay in 2006 was even more dire, basically saying that most of these areas would no longer be viticulturally interesting, with only narrow coastal bands and maybe the Sierra Nevada of any viticultural interest. In New Zealand, there are studies that are implying that they should be changing grapes to grapes that are more in tune to warmer weather. But it's not quite that easy because, for example, the melting of the polar ice cap and high altitude ice packs will have, for example, a cooling effect on northern Atlantic waters, and therefore the northern Atlantic coastlines, which actually means that something like Bordeaux may actually go into a cooler resistant grape varieties rather than the ones that are grown there now. So I think that we're in a dynamic state, a dynamic flux. What is sure is that unless we intervene, we're going to be at odds with fine wine production. There's many things we can do. One of them is certainly adapting our viticulture to these changing conditions by changing both our viticulture and the grape varieties we use.
Just let me ask you, obviously we had this problem. Another possibility is that we begin to work with gene editing on some of the existing varieties we have.
Sure.
How do you feel about gene-edited Chardonnay? Would you be intrinsically suspicious of that, or do you think it's something that might work?
All right, that's a real good question, and I just want to make clear that for people out there who aren't into this as much as we are, gene editing is not the same thing as gene modification. Genetically modified organisms are a completely different thing. There you actually go and introduce genes from other species into somebody else's genome, and there's a lot of problems with that from all sorts of ethical and even practical. When it comes to gene editing, all you're doing is you're deleting or accentuating what is already there. Now that is potentially always an ethical problem because there is, down the road, the problem of creating designer babies and stuff like that. But when it comes to these techniques, when it comes to technology, I always point out people have to realize that technology is not at fault. It's people that are at fault. And it's people that have to be held accountable. A gun, as much as people don't like to hear this, a gun never killed anybody. It's the idiot owner of that gun who left it loaded where maybe a little kid can get to it, and then he shoots himself or the little sister. So either we like it or not, we have to become more accountable. Gene editing, if it means fighting food insecurity, and we have a huge problem with that in this world, is potentially a very good thing. What we have to make sure, though, is for people who cross the line. So when it comes to gene editing in Chardonnay, if we're going to be able to gene edit Chardonnay so it can live in a cooler environment or in an environment that from cool became suddenly warmer, why not? I'm totally for it. Again, and how dishonest some people can be. People need to realize that we have a real problem with crops starting to yield less because of increased climate change. Rice crops all over the world world are yielding about 0.4% less. Corn is down 2 pesticles in a year instead of 2. There are estimates that 10 to 20% of our worldwide crops may be resistant crops, DNA that's there, but just tweaking what is there, that might be a good thing. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. It is open to many ethical problems, but the most important thing is that we allow guidelines. And I think, you know, just looking at how the COVID thing has been handled in organizing themselves and acting in a uniform, unified, and frankly, logical way. Because if you see how COVID has been handled by different countries, you just want to put your hands in your hair. So based on that, I would say gene editing is potentially very dangerous. In theory, it's actually a very good thing.
Okay, fantastic. We're still having problems with your connection, Ian. So I think what I'll do is go on to Karen now, but we'll certainly come back to you when it comes to the question stage. And perhaps you could try turning off your video stream so we just get the audio stream, and that might give us a better feed from you. Okay, Karen.
Okay, I'll try moving.
On to you now. We're going to talk about Chardonnay in particular because that's why we're all here. So has cool won the day? Does anybody drink big fat Chardonnay anymore?
Everybody drinks Kim Kardashian style Chardonnay. I mean, we talk about Audrey Hepburn, you know, but it's really Kim Kardashian that moves off the shelves, it seems like. And, you know, I was looking at the state of California statistics the other day, and Matt's right, there's about 100,000 acres of Chardonnay in California. But it is going down, only slightly though, by about 3,000 acres over the last 10 years. What I find so interesting is in California these days anyway, and to a lesser extent in Oregon and Washington too, is the idea that people have moved their vineyards in some cases to cooler places. They've moved their vocabulary to cool, but they haven't really moved their mindset. They're still making, in many cases, the exact same overblown, overwrought, overdone, over-oaked, over everything kinds of Chardonnays that were made 20 years ago. And to me, that's kind of dangerous. You know, we all probably have notebooks full of taking quotes where people are saying, oh yes, I've moved to Carneros because I like elegance and leanness and these kinds of things. You taste the wine and you think, there's a big disconnect here. So I don't know, it's really interesting that in our lifetimes, I started a little bit after Matt, not that long after though. And, you know, most people living today do not remember a time before Chardonnay, right? Before it was, at least in the States, ubiquitous. I do remember when I started in New York, Sancerre and Vouvray were the leading white wines being sold in New York. But I think what's dangerous here is that most people are talking the cool talk, but not walking the walk.
That's very interesting you say that. I'm just wondering if there are cultural specificities at work here, because when I taste stuff that's available in Europe, and I also, as some of you know, spent some time in Australia, I didn't have that impression at all. I had almost the opposite impression that there were people working in certain warm climates or medium climates at any rate, who were so desperate to make cool climate styles that they were, as it were, forcing the pace in the vineyard with early picking and strategies of that sort. And that to me didn't necessarily always work very well. To me, there was some sort of fake cool climate going on there. I don't know what you think about wines like that.
Yeah, well, I think it's very hard to just decide to pick early and then call it a cool climate wine. It's because, as you were pointing out earlier, Andrew, just getting a bunch of strident acidity to just deciding to go for that does not make it may be psychologically appeasing to the winemaker, but it isn't the same as being from a cool climate. I don't know. I think a lot of this issue of cool climate is tied to a poorly thought through concept of ripeness. Because that's the other thing that shows up in all of our notes, right? Over and over again, people say, well, I really have to get wine ripe, as if it were a moment, a minute on a clock face. But ripeness is also not a singular thing. It's a range of things. And it's a very complex kaleidoscope there about when flavor kind of clicks into a sense of beauty. And yet, to listen to winemakers around the world, you would think that ripeness is one singular moment. But of course it isn't. I don't know. I don't know. There is no answer for your fabulous questions. There's only more thinking about them.
Yeah. No, well, I completely agree with you about the question of ripeness being a vexed one. Indeed, I remember when I was in Australia speaking to a very experienced winemaker, a centenarian winemaker, a guy called Ray Beckwith, who'd worked at the Penfolds many years. And he said he always thought of ripeness as being the winemaking equivalent of Pontius Pilate's question, what is truth? What is ripeness? It was the question that nobody could ever really answer. And I'm probably squabbling about it in another 1,000 years as well.
You know, the other thing I suppose about this, Andrew, that is important to remember, at least in the States, is some of our love of overdone and actually sweet Chardonnay may go back to Prohibition, in the sense that, you know, Prohibition really caused the States to go into a dark ages for 50 years. Really the combination of World War I, the stock market crash, Prohibition, and World War II. Most wine regions in California for a good 50 years went into a dark ages as far as wine is concerned. And then we see the logical rise of cocktails. Probably people who would have been the people of the age of my parents or Matt's parents would have, if they drank wine, they would have been unusual. Most people were drinking things like Coke and Jack Daniels, or some sort of cocktail that was sweet. Wine was perceived as just kind of sour. And so as Chardonnay comes online in the 70s and 80s, it's not so, and becomes the cocktail, the aperitif that a whole generation of people begin to drink. Those wines were overdone as cocktails were overdone. They were kind of thick. They certainly didn't have a sense of pristine beauty. They were sweet, and they had big impact. So I don't know that we'll get out of the big, what I think of as Kim Kardashian style of Chardonnay anytime soon, because the United States anyway, and several other New World countries too, by virtue of Prohibition, lost, they lost an essential wine culture and the aesthetic appreciation that came with that culture.
Okay, let's
Can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah, go on, go around, Matt.
One thing that none of us has brought up yet, and it's, I think, pertinent to what Karen is saying, involves food. If we look historically at many of the wines, the most highly prized, especially white wines, in Europe, let's say 100 years ago, to just arbitrarily choose a time, the food, we're now dealing, of course, not with normal people. We're dealing with upper class, well-to-do people who were eating, as we know, these magnificently elaborate meals. And their food was very rich. They had a lot of rich cream sauces. They were things like hollandaise and béarnaise and many, many other things. And many of the wines, white wines that they prized, that they considered delicious, as you put it, Andrew, were sweet. Sauvignon, for example, was essentially sweet. Even Chardonnays from Burgundy, they weren't necessarily always made to be sweet, but I've had Montrachets that had very noticeable residual sugar, Montrachets from the turn of the century. They didn't really say, oh my God, I made a flawed wine here. They actually thought, well, this is really quite delicious. It'll go beautifully with that hollandaise sauce. Our food now, again, at that same level of socioeconomics, if you will, is very minimalist, very austere. Look at the Japanese influence in so many of the starred restaurants around the world. That kind of opulent ripeness that Karen is referring to, it really doesn't go with that sort of food. But it does, and this is something as Karen and I, as Americans, I think can speak to firsthand, we have a great love in the United States of what I call standalone wines. They're not interested in food. You know, the wine stands on its own. You know, obviously extremely late picked, overripe Cabernets. They're not really meant to go with food. They're standalone wines, and in many cases they're quite delicious when they stand alone. And I'll pull back now, but I think it's pertinent to what Karen was saying. I think we need to look at the context of food and whether or not we're making wines that are intended to go with a meal or are in fact viewed in every sense of the phrase discreetly and are just standalone and have their own legitimacy apart from the table. Sorry, I'll shut up.
You're absolutely right to raise the food context. It's always incredibly important. And of course, also the drinking experience too, not just the tasting experience. I sometimes think that's something that pontificators such as us go on too much about, too much tasting and not enough drinking. Karen, just to go back to cool climate Chardonnay in particular, I think it's true to say that what everybody who's working in a cool climate is interested in doing is making a wine that could be called a vin de terroir, a terroir wine, a wine that is true to its place and representative of its place. And when we think about the greatest wines of that sort in the world, of course, we're always associating them with the place. We say Barolo, we don't say Nebbiolo, and so on and so on and so on. I don't need to repeat that endlessly. So what I'm wondering is the focus on Chardonnay, particularly with cool climate, really something that we should try and move on from? We should be talking about Sonoma Coast, we should be talking about Ontario, we should be talking about Willamette Valley or whatever, rather than always articulating it through the varietal. And perhaps indeed for future editions of this conference, we need to back away from the notion simply of Chardonnay and explore the cool climate itself, the place itself.
I think that would be a truly lovely idea. But of course, it's, again, in this country anyway, you know, you hear all the time the idea of, well, we want to demystify wine. And I think, oh my God, please don't, right? That would be the worst possible thing that could happen to wine, is if it were demystified somehow. But an attempt to just think about wine in very binary terms, it's Chardonnay or it's Cabernet. It's a simple way of making wine seem understandable, because I suppose if we, you know, if collectively around the world it were known, if wines were known only by their place, then that you would have to just sit comfortably with the notion of mystery, of not knowing certain things, of not knowing certain flavors, of not knowing what to expect. And Europeans seem to do that much more easily than we do. I don't know, in America, we like to know things, you know, we want to get to the bottom of it. It's why, as Matt was saying earlier, I know, even today, we probably both know, we could name right now 10 famous winemakers in the Napa Valley that have not been to Europe. How is that conceivable? It's because I think for a lot of winemakers, they want an answer. They've they've studied in school and they're going to experiment until they get their answer. But the idea of going into go back to the mothership where there are no answers, where what you have to only do is embrace all the questions, that's a little unnerving for if you're an American. You really want to get it right, you know? You want to do it.
Another good point, but like you, I'm deeply wedded to complexity and mystery, and deeply suspicious of simple solutions. So I love that notion that the place is always what comes first. And indeed, over the last year, several times I've had a chance to do quite large tastings of Sancerre. And it's been noticeable when I'm doing those tastings. Very often, if you just stop and shut your eyes and think, you could think, well, am I really tasting Sancerre? Am I tasting a Sauvignon Blanc? Or am I in fact tasting a Chablis? Because they're both made on the same soil type. They're not far from each other, about 100 kilometers from each other. And I think if you kind of catch yourself out like that, test yourself, I think fairly soon you come to see that perhaps the varietal has, perhaps we ascribe too much significance to the varietal and not enough to the primacy of place. Anyway, I'm just wondering, time's marching on, we might have lost Ian for good, but I'm sure we have lots and lots of questions. So Magdalena, do you want to come in and offer us some of the questions and we can all chip in on those? Is that a good idea? Let's see if we can get Magdalena up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm just screening a couple things. There are definitely some diverse questions, and I'm just really absorbing all the great things that you guys are all saying. I think we're getting lots of positive feedback that people love so many nuggets of the things that you are saying. So I'm going to just try to see which one is, I think this is a good one, and maybe you've already answered it. And if you did, apologies, but is cool climate wine acceptable as a style alone, or does it need to be combined with its origin as well to make any sense?
Well, shall I just start on that rather briefly? To me, it's not acceptable as a style on its own. That really is a trap. The moment you start saying cool climate is a certain requirement for this, that, or the other, you're lost already, because you're going to be either effacing or denying what your raw materials are going to present to you at the time of harvest if you ferment them in a limpid kind of manner. So I would be very wary of that. My fellow panelists may disagree, but I would say you should always say, I'm working in a cool climate. This place has delivered the climate to me, but what does this place want me to do with this varietal in this place? Try and listen to the vineyard, try and be a vineyard whisperer, if you like.
I think that's good. Doesn't Karen or Matt, do you have any extra comments on that, or do you agree with Andrew?
Karen?
I completely agree. I think though that Andrew's early comment about climate being only one step on the ladder is an important one, because you have to listen to all kinds of other things too. You're not just listening to the climate, you're listening to the range of what could be ripeness. In fact, you could almost argue that that if one were more intuitive, worked from an intuitive basis rather than an academic basis, what you learned in viticultural school, maybe that would be helpful in thinking through all the notions that you have to listen to. I mean, I'll add one thing that I learned early on a lot about this beginning notion of cool climate, although as Matt says, when I was listening to these two people who I'm about to mention, they never used the term cool climate because it was before that. One was David Lett in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, who talked about marginality. And the other was Kermit Lynch, who said to me as a young journalist, music isn't better because you play it louder. Music is better when music is better. And that's all there is. And I've never forgotten that idea. So it's not just about coolness, it's also about volume and amplification and all those other very subtle decisions that winemakers are constantly making and that we're making as we buy wines. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm rambling there a bit, but I'll give you one other analogy that I love though, which is when I think about ripeness, I think about making scrambled eggs. You know how to get perfect scrambled eggs, you have to take them off the heat 1 minute before. You take that pan off the heat when those scrambled eggs are done, they're going to be overdone, right? So there's this notion of doing things slightly before, because once they're really done, you've locked on top of that place a few ideas that now will never be uncoupled from that. The winemaker of Screaming Eagle has started out as a kid learning about fireworks. And he said that this group of old Italians who made fireworks taught him that that when you're in the firework business, everything is about the ascent before it bursts. If you don't get the ascent right, then forget it. After the firework has gone off, it's way too late. It's all about what happens before you hit the big idea. And there's something in that rings true for me when it comes to wine.
Okay, I think those are great answers, and I'm just trying to digest. There are so many questions, so I just want to mention that thank you to the over 200 people that are, streaming this whole time, and also lots of questions. So again, I think, everyone's answered parts of this question, but I think the way this has been put together, it's articulated well again is, so from the marketing side, oh, and there's Ian, he's come back. He's inside a building now. Great. Ian, can you hear us? Ian is connecting to audio. Okay. There's Ian.
Here I am.
Okay, awesome.
Sorry about this. I don't know what happened, but I'm here.
Okay, great. Do you want me to ask a question? We're just going through question and answer now, but
Fair enough.
Andrew, do you want to go back to asking Ian a couple more things first, or what did you want to do?
No, let's stick with question and answer. And when you read out the question, Magdalena, perhaps you'll just put a person's name on it to speak first. That's probably going to be the most efficient way of getting answers out of this. Okay, sure. That's perfect. Okay, so maybe I'll ask Matt Kramer this one. Is cool climate overused in marketing as a temporary fashion that neglects the question of loveliness or deliciousness? This person's from the trade, so are we, the trade, focusing too much on discussing climate as opposed to style, although they're clearly linked? Or is it an important back part of the story for any wine?
Well, look, let's be honest. If you're in the trade, the object is to sell wine. And you will do and say pretty much anything you need to do and say to get people to reach for their wallets. And if cool climate makes people, open their purses and reach for their wallets, then you say cool climate. Look, we've addressed this in other ways. Karen was just talking about it. Fine wine, really compelling wine, delicious wine, use the phrase whatever you like, is by definition a mosaic. It is a mosaic of grape and place and, yes, climate and soil, and let's not forget mentality, how you choose to approach the way you want to make the wine, the way you want to grow the grapes that you're choosing. Andrew was referring earlier to Alsace. Alsace had a tradition not of the varietalness that we know today. They're the one place in France that has long named their wines varietally. But if you go back, let's say 200 years, they were field blends. In fact, if you go back 200 years, nearly everybody's wine was a field blend. It was a field blend in Piedmont. It was a field blend, of course, obviously to this day in Bordeaux. And much to many people's surprise, it was a field blend in Burgundy. The white Burgundies 150 years ago were, in fact, typically blends of Chardonnay, what they called Pinot Bureau, which is Pinot Gris, Aligoté, Pinot Blanc, probably some mutations of white Pinot Noir. So our notion of what wine is or should be, or how it gets discussed, cool climate, varietalness, is really transient. It changes from generation to generation. And our notion of deliciousness also gets modified based on the food we're eating, our psychological and emotional needs. We have a great need in our time for perfections of purity, for lack of a better phrase, authenticity. These are deep emotional and psychological needs of our time for reasons that I think many people can figure out for themselves. And we want our wines to reflect that. It's one of the reasons why the Burgundian concept of terroir has become so powerful today, is because it reflects a concept of authenticity, of purity, of site specificity that is extremely gratifying to us psychologically and emotionally. We want it, we need it, we pay for it. But cool climate in and of itself is almost meaningless. It's a mosaic. How's that?
That was a fulsome answer. Does anybody else have an additional chime in on that? I'm just quickly looking to see. This could get a little bit, I don't know. Are you're okay, Ian? You can hear us. We can hear you.
Sure. Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Specifically then for you, do you think regarding viticultural approaches to mitigate climate change, do you think dry farming is a viable approach or a shift?
I think definitely. I think we have to rethink our farming methods altogether. I think because of all the consequences of global warming and climate change, we have to rethink the viticulture completely. For the past 30 years, we've tried to lower yields as much as possible and trying to make more concentrated and hopefully better wines. In fact, that's probably something we can't do anymore, both because of the decrease in water availability and because of climate change itself and rising alcohol levels in the wines we're making. In Alsace, we were talking about, they used to harvest grapes there in October and even November, and now they're harvesting them regularly in September and sometimes in August, the Pinot Blancs with which to make the Cremants. And they're still making wines at 16% alcohol, which is probably something you don't want to do. So definitely, I think things such as clearly dry farming, planting at higher altitudes, which is what we're doing already, orientation of the rows, changing it altogether, changing the exposure. All these viticultural techniques are going to have to be implemented to come up with more viable farming in today's climate situation, including choosing different grape varieties, because clearly grape varieties that have historically been associated with certain places may no longer be totally adapted to those places. And that goes, again, not just related to temperature, but to many other factors such as drought or salt concentrations of the soils. I mean, there are places in coastal North America or Australia whereby we're going to need to start planting grape varieties that have a much higher salt soil tolerance than the ones that we're using nowadays.
Okay, that's great. So I think we're getting near the end of the webinar, and I know I, for one, and many of the people on this could sit here all day listening to all of you, which is, but I think I'd like to take this opportunity because I think there's enough questions coming from our Canadian audience, especially Ontarians, which you know, are really excited about having you all, and the fact that you've all been to Ontario for this conference. I'm wondering if, and this could be hard, if each of you in maybe 2 minutes, one by one, can just, you know, what is it about Ontario Chardonnay that, you know, can you describe how you feel, you know, as a cool climate? I don't know if you need to talk about it from a cool climate specific perspective, but what is it about Ontario Chardonnays that are identifiable to you? And again, each of you have different experiences with the Ontario Chardonnays you've tasted. So why don't we ask, we'll go in order of, how about Matt first, because you came here 10 years ago, so maybe you can, and again, I think we just probably have a couple minutes each if you are able to do that.
All right, I'll do my best to be brief. Karen, I think we're looking at you at the moment. Are we starting with Karen?
No,
no.
starting with
We're
Matt.
starting with you.
Starting.
Oh, I see. I said, beg your pardon. All right. I want to make sure I understand the question. My impressions, our impressions of cool climate Chardonnay from Ontario. Is that correct, Magdalena?
Yes. What are your impressions? And I guess what, if you're able to connect something that's identifiable for you as Ontario Chardonnay?
Well, my impressions, of course, have always been extremely positive. I first came to Ontario wines in 1983 and have been there multiple times, as you know, since then. Obviously, there is a lean but not mean element to Ontario Chardonnay. I find, and I have no problem using the word, a distinct minerality. Whether it's from limestone soils or not, I'll leave to Alex Maltman and the geologists to argue endlessly, but I believe there is minerality, and I believe it does come from the soil, and I believe that Ontario has it. I certainly have described the Chardonnays from Prince Edward County as being like Chablis discovering a long lost cousin that washed up on the shores of Lake Ontario. And it still strikes me that way. I love those wines. I think there's a great distinction to them. I would defy anybody to find me a Chardonnay, no matter how fine, in California or Oregon or Washington, that tastes like a Chardonnay from Ontario. What that derives from, I really couldn't say, but I would be prepared to do a blind tasting and say, okay, line them up. I honestly believe that Ontario would stand out as Ontario for whatever the reasons might be. That's my probably more than 2 minutes.
Awesome, that's wonderful. So can we go to then Karen next, I guess?
Yeah, when I came up to Ontario, I was really knocked out by those Chardonnays. I love the concept of flavor without weight. In fact, maximum flavor with minimum weight. And it's almost like you're tasting, I don't know, something very metaphysical then. So along with Matt, you know, I find the distinct sleekness and minerality attractive, but this idea of that they were almost vibrational. They had flavor and tension, but they weren't literally weighted down by big body, was lovely. So it was like watching ballet or something, right? You watch someone lift into the air and you think, how can someone have that energy, but without weight, without so much gravity? It's such a phenomenal sense, and energy, tension, and flavor are things that I love in wine. So I'm a big fan. I just wish we could get them more easily. Magdalena, can't you do something about that? We're begging you. The journalists of the world are begging you. Get those wines out of Canada so we can buy them down here.
Well, I know many wineries are trying and they will continue. And I think we've made some good headway over the years. And having all of you visit and learn more and help share the story is benefiting all of us. So we'll go to Ian next. He, of course, is Canadian and has learned, he'll tell you himself that he's a long-standing understanding of our wines from when he was a teenager. I think that's when he fell in love. So I'll let you speak to that, Ian. Can you tell us, why do you love
Sure.
Ontario Chardonnay?
I do actually. You know, if you tell people I'm Canadian, that sort of disqualifies me now, because people are going to say, of course, she's going to say great things. Well, you shouldn't say that. You should say I'm Italian. No, but I'm Canadian, Canadian-born, very proud. Huge Toronto Maple Leafs fan, Blue Jays, Raptors now. Having said that, I really want to make it clear, and not because I'm at i4C. I've said this before, I've written it before. I think Canada makes world-class Chardonnays. I really do believe that. I think they are remarkably good. And I think, I'll give you an example. I live in Italy half the year, and there is no doubt in my mind that Canadian Chardonnays are wildly better than just about anything made in Italy. And we tend to think of Italy as one of the old world countries that should be heads and shoulders above everybody else when it comes to wine, like France. But in fact, that's not so. Italian Chardonnays are generally pretty poor, and I can think of only a handful that I'd ever drink. But it's not the case at all. I think Canada, with examples by Bachelder, examples by anything that Deb Pascas did over the years, already back in the 90s when she was working with Steve Temkin. These are just amazingly great Chardonnays that also speak of terroir. To use Matt Kramer's most famous and favorite phrase, they speak of somewhereness. Chardonnays that come from the 20 Mile Bench, the Short Hills Bench, the Beamsville Bench, they're all very different. That's just in Niagara, and they're completely different from PEC, Prince Edward County, and they're completely different from just about anything being made in Okanagan. So these are great weightless. I love that that analogy that Karen came up with. These are weightless but very flavorful Chardonnays, have laser-like acidities. They are able to communicate the essence of the land, and they do so in such a way that you don't have to put up with 15% alcohol, with a ton of butter, butterscotch, hazelnuts. It's just a refreshing, mineral-driven, site-specific wine. And Ontario in particular can be very proud of it. Ontario is very good at making some other things as well, Riesling, Cabernet Franc, but there's no doubt that Canadian Chardonnays and Ontario Chardonnays in particular are world class. I really believe that, and it's not because I'm here at i4C.
That's amazing. Thank you for articulating that. So I think what we'll ask Andrew to wrap that up to give us his perceptions, because again, I think the first time that I hosted him in Ontario was in the middle of Ice Wine, actually in January, and he was gracious enough to join 6 sommeliers, I think from the UK and from the US. He was the only writer, and definitely always a different experience when you mix different people together. So I always remember how great that was, and that was your first experience. So if you tell us what your feelings are about Ontario.
Sure. Yeah, I will never forget that winter trip. The experience of the Canadian winter was something very precious to me. I'd heard so much about it, but I'd never felt it for myself. And perhaps I should also fess up to my grandmother, who was born in Owen Sound. So I have a little bit of Ontario in me via her. Okay, what do I love about them? Well, you know, you travel all around the world in this job, an enormous privilege, of course. And you come to all sorts of Chardonnays made in all sorts of places, as you must. It's virtually ubiquitous. And very often they're impressive, they taste well, but they're a little bit hard to drink. There is a drinkability problem quite often about Chardonnay produced outside Europe, I believe. Not in Ontario. That's what I love mostly about Ontario Chardonnay, is its unshowiness, its lack of showiness, its softness, its subtlety. These are wines that don't come leaping out of the glass and beat you about the head in any way at all. They're stealthy wines. They're wines you have to creep up to. They're wines you have to spend a little bit of time with. You have to talk to them. You have to shake their hands. You have to sit beside them for a while. You have to let them come out of the glass and meet you. And that's really what I love about those wines. I can't really think of any non-European Chardonnay that does that quite as well as Ontario Chardonnay does. And that's why I believe very much in its future, because, you know, Matt mentioned the whole mealtime context earlier. To me, this is an absolutely key quality that you're looking for in Chardonnay. If you want to sit and spend the meal with it, sit and have the second and the third glass, sit and drain the bottle with your partner. All of these things are extraordinarily important. And I really feel you can do that with Ontario Chardonnay in a way that's rather hard with Chardonnays from other places. So bravo for your unshowiness, bravo for your stealthiness, your subtlety, your softness, your undemonstrativeness. These qualities will stand you in great stead in the years ahead.
Well, I had to put myself back on screen so you could see my big smile, and I know that everyone in Ontario and Canada, many other great regions in Canada besides Ontario, but you know, we are here today in Ontario, that you've really provided some great authentic insight. And this session, I know personally, and a lot of the comments I'm getting on Instagram and otherwise, people have really been excited about this. It's been a wonderful discussion. So thank you for coming all together from across different countries today to do this amazing day. And I want to apologize to the people that we couldn't get to their questions. If there's anything extra that you want to, please do send an email to me personally or to the i4C email, and we will get back to you. So cheers. I wish we actually had wine in our glasses. We didn't do that, but oh, you do. Okay, good.
So I'm allowed to.
It's nighttime for you. So yeah, we have a busy day, but cheers. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. And I hope to see you all soon in person sometimes next year. Keep safe and be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.